working folk don't have a chance unless we organise. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Tell me, which side are you on?
Our next two speakers are both from the Centre of Full Employment and Equity, which is known as, the acronym is COFFEE for short. So if I start talking about COFFEE, you know what I mean. COFFEE is an official research centre at Newcastle University and seeks to promote research aimed at restoring full employment and achieving an economy that delivers equitable outcomes for all. This is the 70th anniversary of the White Paper on Full Employment, and our next speaker, Dr. Victor Quirk, will take us through the history of the White Paper and how it worked. Victor, just for background, has 30 years of experience as a specialist labour market practitioner, and he writes on the political economic opposition to full employment. So please welcome to the microphone, Victor.
Thanks, Nick. That's great. And thank you for the invitation to come and speak of politics in the pub in Katoomba. It's given me an excuse for a long weekend and to catch up with friends who are based in Leura, who I haven't seen for probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. So that's been great. And yes, the reason I got invited here, I think, was Nick attended this anniversary commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the publication of the Commonwealth Government's White Paper, Full Employment for Australia. Now this was a formal statement of policy intent of the Curtin Labor Government's plans for maintaining the full employment that the Second World War, the expenditure, public sector expenditure and employment that occurred in the mobilisation for the war effort, it rapidly produced full employment by about 1942. Now this was sort of significant because this came 10 years after the 1930s depression, when a previous Labor government had fought to bring in measures to reflate the Australian economy that were all blocked, firstly by the Conservatives that had control over the Senate, and also by industrialists who were controlling what was then acting as the quasi-central bank of Australia, the Commonwealth Bank. And those interests were all heavily in connection and cahoots with the British bankers who were demanding that Australia adopt austerity measures during the Depression before they were prepared to extend any loans to Australia of sterling currency. This is during 1930 and 31. Now the significance of those loans was that Australia owed Britain a debt of something like £500 million. And most of that debt had been incurred when we fought the First World War. Because for the privilege of fighting the First World War, in which 62,000 Australians lost their lives, we had to buy firstly the transportation, the ammunition, the uniforms, the food supplies, all that off British manufacturers. And they wanted to be paid in British currency. And so the Australian government had to go to British banks and borrow the money off the British banks in order that we could pay the British manufacturers so that we could go and fight the First World War for them. And that was the debt that we owed the British in 1930, when the British banks demanded that they would not extend any loans to us to make the loan repayments, because, you know, the whole agricultural markets around the world had collapsed and we didn't have the means, even though we were selling off masses of wheat and other sorts of commodities. The prices had fallen so low that it wasn't enough to generate the sterling currency that we needed to pay the £28 million a year debt that we were expected to pay off to Britain until 1965. And so that's why, like the Greeks are experiencing today with the IMF and the World Bank and the European Central Bank, we were having austerity measures demanded cuts to pensions, cuts to wages, public sector wages, in the middle of the 1930s depression. Now when the government, the Labor government of the time, argued that, and we were fortunate in who we had as the Treasurer at that time, was a very interesting character. I'm going to tell you a bit about him in a few minutes, but the issue really was that we actually did have policies, a government that had policies that would have actually pulled us out of the Depression. But these were all blocked. And the argument of the Conservatives was that firstly, the government didn't have the money, and that we'd get into more trouble if the government spent money that it didn't have. And if it did spend the money and did employ people, it would cause hyperinflation like it happened in the Weimar Republic in Germany. So when 1939 came along and the war, the threat of war was right upon us, the Conservative government of the time started spending money, and Australia progressively moved towards full employment. By the time the Curtin government was elected in late 1941, and shortly after, a couple of months later, the Japanese hit Pearl Harbor, the whole country was mobilised for the war effort, and there was massive public expenditure, massive amounts of public sector employment to build all the infrastructure necessary to mount the war effort against the Japanese. And by mid-1942, we were operating at something like 1% unemployment. So what happened then was, the issue was then that members of the public were slightly quizzical, especially veterans of the previous war, because when they went off to fight the First World War, they were all promised that they'd come back to a land fit for heroes. And what actually happened was, when the war ended, it lost control over the wartime controls over the economy that are permitted under our constitution. They all ended as soon as the hostilities finished. And the government lost control of the economy, and those soldiers came back to very high levels of unemployment. And it's an interesting thing that in Queensland at the time, there was a Labor government whose premier was this fellow called Ted Theodore. Now Ted's a very interesting character. He was self-educated from the age of 14. He'd gone off to work in the goldfields of Western Australia at the age of 16. In his early 20s he was a union organiser in Queensland, and by 25 he was elected to the Queensland Parliament and was the Treasurer of Queensland. By the age of 30 he became the Premier, and that was in 1919. And to deal with this unemployment that the soldiers had come back from the war to face, the 10% unemployment in Queensland, Theodore decided he'd do something about it. And he instigated a policy that embraced an old Labor principle that has long been forgotten and which I think we need to remember again. And that was a principle known as the right to work. This was a central policy platform of the very early Labor movement of the 19th century. And it was a proposition that said that when the private sector didn't wish to employ somebody, the government had a responsibility to offer them decent work and thereby eliminate unemployment. Now this was a concept that was held in as high regard and was just as central to the Labor movement as the right to form a union, the right to vote, the right to an 8-hour day. The right to work was a pillar of the Labor movement as those other pillars. And the interesting thing is that all of those other propositions were eventually, and in Australia's case quite early, they were conceded to working people. The right to work was never ever conceded. And you might think, that's a strange thing. Why is it that anyone would not like the idea of unemployment being eliminated? Well, during the Second World War, when the proposition of establishing post-war full employment was underway the debates were underway in Australia, but they were also underway in other countries around the world, including England. The debate became quite candid. So usually this is something that's not normally talked about. But in 1943, for instance, the Times, an editorial in the Times, explained why full employment's not a good idea. It said, unemployment is not a mere accidental blemish in a private enterprise economy. On the contrary, it's part of the essential mechanism of the system and has a definite function to fulfill. The first function of unemployment, which has always existed in open or disguised form, is that it maintains the authority of master over man. The master has normally been in a position to say, if you do not want the job, there are plenty of others who do. When the man can say, if you do not want to employ me, there are plenty of others who will, the situation is radically altered. Now, one of the saddest things for me, having done the research that I have done, is the way that working people in Australia have actually forgotten a basic truth, and that is that governments have complete control over the level of unemployment. That for 32 years, from 1942 to 1974, it was the policy of successive Labor and Liberal governments to use public sector employment and expenditure to keep the level of unemployment in Australia below 2%. And for those 32 years, it did not vary above that target. It was a deliberate act of policy. Now, during that 30-year period after the war, think about what actually happened, what the implications of that was. Because it empowered working people. It meant that, for instance, the gap between rich and poor actually narrowed during that period. That the labour market decasualised, and people increasingly came to have, more or less always, permanent employment. Home ownership became increasingly the norm, because a lot of the employment, public sector employment that was generated was to produce public sector housing. And access to public housing was actually quite a normal thing in that post-war period. It helped a lot of young, early families get their deposits together to go off and buy their own home. But this is something that we've actually forgotten about. When full employment was abandoned in 1975, amidst the political turmoil of the sacking of the Whitlam government, from that point onwards, over the past 40 years, the working class of this country has been going steadily backwards. Our labour market's become increasingly casualised. The standards of public provision have all declined. For a period there we had, free higher education. That's all gone. Now it's this incredibly expensive thing. The actual quality of the universities and the schools and the hospitals has actually declined despite all the improvements in technology. And all of this is because working people have lost the power that they had when there was full employment. When trade unionism maintained record high levels of trade union membership all through that period. And as soon as the full employment finished, trade unionism has steadily declined because workers are increasingly insecure about identifying themselves with the union movement because they're worried about losing their jobs. So, knowing all of this stuff, I should have said something about myself before I started talking. I was an unemployed youth back in the late 1970s. And then I became, after several inappropriate public service jobs that I had, I ended up in the Commonwealth Employment Service and became a specialist careers counsellor, employment counsellor in the Commonwealth Employment Service. And throughout that whole period, it became increasingly apparent to me that all the policies that governments used in relation to unemployment, all of them were about managing the unemployed. and forcing them to compete more ferociously for jobs. None of them were actually about reducing unemployment. And after many years, I ran a Skillshare training centre and I ran a job network agency in a few places like that. All throughout that period, I was extremely aware of the fact that even though I might be quite effective in helping this person that I was working with to, get further up the queue towards getting a job, helping them get training or do their CV for them or something like that, effectively at the same time, by their advance up the queue, someone else was being shifted back in the queue. And that the only way really to be really effective in helping unemployed people was to reduce the number of people who were unemployed. And that requires the provision of more jobs. And that's why, after many years of this, about 2002, I decided I'd do a PhD, and I shopped around Australia looking for a place where I could do it. And eventually I found this mob in Newcastle, run by this guy called Bill Mitchell. And that's what he was actually advocating, a professor of economics who had been advocating a specific policy idea, a model that he had for restoring full employment that dealt with some of those inflation control issues that became problematic in the mid-70s. And that's where I ended up doing my PhD, and that's why I went to the Centre of Full Employment Inequity and how I met Bill. So in a few minutes, Bill's going to do a presentation, and hopefully he'll go over some of the details of how these concepts of how you could re-establish full employment can come about. But the critical thing that I wanted to emphasise in talking to today was to understand that full employment is, I should say unemployment, is not due to any economic impediment. It's not actually an economic technical question. It's actually a political question. And what's really sad is that this was perfectly well understood by Australians all throughout that period, because it's sometimes confusing for people to understand that when Robert Menzies, all throughout the war, fought strenuously to stop the establishment of full employment after the war, by the time 1949 came along and he won the 1949 election, to win that election, he had to make these absolute declarations, because Labor was saying, if you vote for Menzies, he will get rid of the full employment, because of how he conducted himself during the war. And Menzies had to swear blind he would not do it. Labor said, he said he was going to maintain full employment. Labor said he's going to redefine full employment from 2% to 6 to 8%. That's how he's going to maintain full employment. Menzies had to come out and explicitly say, I will keep unemployment at 2%, I will use public sector job creation to do it. So when he got into power, and given the fact that the public fully understood how the full employment was brought about, they understood the economics behind it, they understood that it was due to the public sector's involvement in the economy. Throughout his 16 years as Prime Minister, hating it as much as he did, Menzies had to maintain the full employment, because any time he tried to trim a bit of public expenditure, Labor and the trade unions would come out and say, told you, he's abandoning full employment. And the polls, the government standing in the polls, would absolutely collapse immediately. And government ministers had to rush out and say, no, we promise we're going to maintain the full employment. And that's why the full employment was maintained all throughout that period, because the public and the Labor movement demanded it. Now, I'm just here to say to you today that we could actually have full employment again. And all it really requires is for Australian working people to demand it. And problems like we heard, from Nancy? Jane, sorry. Issues about the plight of workers that are highlighted by what Jane has just sort of talked about, instantly the balance of power would shift. And a whole stack of issues of great importance and significance to improving the quality of life of working people would be reversed. And so that's why I say to you, consider the propositions that Bill and his many colleagues around the world are arguing for, that we need to make a focus of the labour movement, the re-establishment of full employment. And can I just say to you, just to conclude, that this was understood back in 1947 when the United Nations declared the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I want you to just hear what the Article 23 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights said. Everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favourable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. And I believe we should fight to get that established as policy in Australia immediately. Thank you.